Trump administration tariffs on imports from over 90 countries across the world are now in effect. Among those impacted is the Republic of Korea. Trade relations were a major issue when President Trump met with President Lee Jae Myung at the White House on Monday. India could see additional tariffs up to 50% imposed on it later this week. And Washington has also slammed Brazil with tariffs of 50% on most of its exports to the United States. To discuss all of this, I'm joined now from Oregon by Liang. She is chair professor in economics at Willamette University. With me here in the studio is Bruna Santos. She is director of the Brazil program at Inter-American Dialogue. Also with us is Anthony Chan. He is a former chief economist at JPMorgan Chase & Company. And joining us too is Sourabh Gupta. He is Senior Asia-Pacific Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for being with us. Sourabh, as I said, President Trump met with the Republic of Korea President Lee Jae Myung at the White House on Monday. South Korean exports to the United States have been capped at 15%, but there was a threat at one time that it could be 25%. Both countries now, with this deal on 15%, also looking at other deals concerning shipbuilding, training of personnel, South Korea buying energy from the United States as well. Did both sides get something out of this?
Yes, I think both sides did. I think from the South Koreans, they just want a working arrangement with Trump, and a working arrangement which does not disadvantage them vis-a-vis their other advanced economy peers. So from that standpoint, I think the meeting has gone off well, or at least at minimum, there are no nasty surprises. You know, when you come and meet Trump in the Oval Office, you never know what might happen. In that regard, it has gone off well. It helps for South Korea from two standpoints. One is the heavy lifting was mostly done by Japan with regard to the negotiations because South Korea had its political turmoil. So the terms that have been applied, the template which was applied to Japan has more or less been applied to South Korea. Doesn't disadvantage them fundamentally. It's more or less equal. The South Koreans said, we had a free trade agreement with you on cars, so our tariffs should be, and there used to be a 2.5% tariff on cars, so we should have a slightly lower tariff, 12.5% on cars. But I mean, those are the little issues. But the important thing is that South Korea has much to offer the US also in batteries, in shipbuilding, in cars, and in chips. And so I think it can be an important investor. And so from that standpoint, I think the meeting has gone well and South Korea has much to bring to the table. And as I said, now has a working relationship with Trump in a productive and constructive way. And I think that's what they were looking for.
Right. Let me go to Anthony Chan. Anthony, good to see you. Of course, South Korea is just one of 90 countries, as I mentioned, that the US has hit with tariffs. I mean, how much impact will this have on South Korea? It's one of the bigger economies in the world and one of the big manufacturing centers internationally. And what are the benefits that will accrue to the United States?
Well, I think the benefits is that it allows the United States to align more closely with South Korea. I think that South Korea will benefit because in some sense, it will allow South Korea to form sort of an arrangement with the United States and Japan in order to be in a better position when it has to deal with North Korea. For the United States, the benefits are that part of the agreement is to share some of those defense costs in protecting South Korea, greater economic cooperation. So in a sense, in return for all these benefits that go to both countries to some extent benefit, including South Korea, who originally, as you said, Anand, had a 25% tariff imposed, and that was reduced to 15%. Of course, in today's meeting, the South Koreans wanted that tariff rate to come down even lower from 15%. And to some extent, that may have been somewhat disappointing. But all the other things that I mentioned are still a net positive for both countries.
You know, Anthony, as we said earlier on, there is something for both sides in this, both sides being the United States and South Korea. But what about growth in trade? Will we see much of that?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead, yeah. You know, as I said, you know, there's something for both sides in this, but what about growth in trade between South Korea and the United States?
I think there is going to be an opportunity for a growth in trade, especially now that the tariff rate has come down from 25% to 15%. And there seems to be a little bit of more goodwill between both countries. So there definitely will be an opportunity for growth in trade between South Korea and the United States.
Yan Liang, good to see you, Yan Liang. China and the United States, they've been in tariff talks for quite some time. These talks started earlier this year. Now, the two countries have, for now, agreed on a 90-day pause, and they agreed on that earlier this month on tariffs. And those tariffs could have got up to 145%. What is the outlook for progress?
Right. Good to talk to you, Anand. So I think both sides agree to continue this tariff truce until November the 10th this year. So I think it remains to be seen whether or not Xi and President Trump would actually meet in person at the end of this year, maybe at the sideline of APEC. That might be an opportunity for both sides to really sort of seal a deal. I think in the meantime, I would say both sides are really working in a cautious way and not to derail any progress so far. I think both sides now agree in some ways to uphold their trade talks back in London and Stockholm. For example, the U.S. will continue to relax the tech ban on exports of H20, for example, some of the chips to China, and China will relax some of the constraints on the rare earth exports to the United States. So I think that is a in a way it is a fragile, but it's still a relatively sort of equilibrium at this point. So I think furthermore, Trump definitely would have a lot more to ask from China. For example, the Boeing 500 potential aircraft sales to China or agricultural exports to China. That's probably on Trump's wish list among other things. And at the same time, I think China does have the interest to continue with the trade talk to normalize the relationships. But that said, I think still the trading relationships between the United States and the rest of the world is still in a very much flux situation. Even for South Korea, even though there is some kind of trade deal, but I think there are also thorny issues that I think Korea is still asking for. North Korea, for example, it was clear that they are not going to accept the further denuclearization, and said the U.S. should just accept them as a nuclear power. Not to mention, I think President Lee is known for not to pick sides between the U.S. and China, but it's not clear whether or not Trump will have any ask on that front. So I think the situation is still quite interesting at this point, and with the Trump's unpredictable policy going forward, I think it really remains to be seen whether any trade deals can be struck.
Okay, Bruna, great to have you with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, Brazil is one of the hardest hit countries. It's facing, what is it, tariffs of 50%. Why has the Trump administration targeted Brazil with such high levies? And what's the prospect for this perhaps to be resolved at some stage soon?
So first of all, I think it's important to notice that Brazil has a trade deficit with the United States. So the economic motivation there is questionable. And I think there are a number of things that motivated that. The first one, obviously, is what President Trump mentioned in his letter, which is the fact that the U.S. is not satisfied with the way that Bolsonaro, Brazil's former president, is being treated by Brazil's judiciary in an investigation, and now a trial starting in early September. But the problem with that ask and question for President Lula is that that investigation and trial is happening in another branch of power, in the judiciary. So that ask from Lula is undoable. Then you have a second thing that happened earlier this year, which is the BRICS summit, and the fact that Lula was hosting it in Brazil. And obviously, I think it built momentum, because when Trump looks at Brazil getting closer to the BRICS countries, he sees Brazil's drifting from the U.S. sphere of influence, and that somehow upsets Washington. And third, that I think it's also important and happened earlier this year, is how big tech companies, social media companies, most importantly, most of them U.S. companies, but not only, have been impacted by social media regulation ruled also by Brazil's Supreme Court. I think all that created some sort of imperfect or perfect storm that generated that reaction from Washington. But in the end of the day, I think Washington never really understood Brazil's non-alignment strategy, Brazil's trying to hedge bets in a U.S.-China competition.
And Bruna, look, it's very clear particularly with Brazil, that Trump is openly using tariffs for political ends. Could this be resolved soon? I mean, could there be talks on the table?
I think there's been two layers of approach here. One is obviously, I think, a political aspect of it, where Brazil has a position in a very firm stance, saying that they will not negotiate its sovereignty, because, as I said, the ask from Brazil is being held and is being dealt with in the judiciary. So the executive branch, Lula cannot do anything. But then in the second layer, which is negotiating exceptions, discussing, putting at the table hard conversations like exceptions for ethanol, opening conversations about other sectors, critical minerals, even the tech sector. I think those things Brazil has demonstrated that they are open to negotiate, but they don't have not found like an openness from the U.S. side to engage in a conversation. So I don't see in the short term any big negotiation coming through, but we still have hearings in the USTR. The U.S. Trade Administrator's Office is holding hearings on September 3rd. We also have Bolsonaro's trial coming up in early September. I think all that will trigger some more movements in that respect.
Sourabh, talking about linkage between Trump's tariffs and political ends, Trump is also going after India. He's going after India hard. 25% tariffs are already in effect. It could jump to 50%. Of course, the Trump administration is upset with India for buying oil from Russia. There are talks underway. I mean, what is the status of those talks right now?
The talks are happening, but it's happening more through back channels. In fact, the Trump administration, not Trump necessarily, but the Trump administration has been pushing India away for a while, pushing India away because they don't want to get ahead of what Mr. Trump wants to do with India. And Mr. Trump can be mercurial. And at this point of time, he is determined to impose those 25% additional tariffs, which will take it to 50%. And so at this point of time, I don't think that it would be un-Trumpian for him to just walk back those 25% with nothing on the table. Maybe down the line, they can discuss something, the two sides. But at this point of time, it's certainly going to apply on India. It has come as a shock to India because Russia was not seen as a maximum pressure state in terms of US policy with regard to Russia. That was Iran and Venezuela. And so the Indians had a kind of, the Americans were winking that, yeah, you could purchase oil from them at a certain price cap, et cetera, and keep the oil market working. And now suddenly that's gone down poorly with India because of the sanctions. India, through the Cold War, had been subject to US non-proliferation sanctions, and therefore India was always so, even though those sanctions have been lifted and India has been brought into the non-communication, non-proliferation environment, within the non-proliferation discussions as a full member, still, I mean, the fact that US is imposing sanctions unilaterally has gone down very, very poorly. What I think will need to happen is Mr. Modi will have to come on bended knee at some point of time, maybe at the UN General Assembly time, and speak directly with Mr. Trump and hope that rubs off. But what we're seeing from this is Mr. Trump India may be an ally, a partner, but India, he just doesn't see India as being a major power. That's Russia and China. India is a pawn within that great power maneuvering, and that's not going to change.
Do you see any scenario, Sourabh, where India would give up buying oil from Russia?
Yeah, reduce it, yes. The US is a very important player, a partner for India. So India will try to figure a way to do what the US wants and pay the Russians in a different coin in different aspects of this thing. So I can see real reductions happening at the Indian side, but happening quietly and not under very direct threat, because Mr. Modi cannot be seen to taking these humiliating stances.
Right. Anthony, Trump has promised that the tariffs will have a major benefit for the United States economy. He says manufacturers, I mean, including those in the pharma industry, those manufacturers currently based overseas, will come back to the United States. What's your view? I mean, will these tariffs be a great boost for the US economy?
Well, there's no question that when you have these tariffs, it does protect some industries. But if you look at history, these tariffs offer limited benefits because remember, the theory of comparative advantage suggests that you should continue to allow countries that produce things at lower cost to produce them. Everyone benefits. And all of a sudden, when you're trying to force all these industries to come to the United States all at once, it's certainly not only is it not efficient, but we have a very tight labor market in the United States. So whether it's manufacturing, whether it's pharmaceuticals, very, very challenging. Similar thing with the semiconductors, bringing them all into the United States. What we're seeing now, even in Arizona, as companies like TSMC is trying to bring and build plants in Arizona, they're having challenges finding workers to actually work in those plants. So I think it's very unrealistic to think that you can bring all that production back to the United States and find labor when, one, you have such a tight labor market. And by the way, the labor market is getting tighter and tighter, as the estimates suggest that you might have as much as 1 million deportations per year. So the labor supply is getting much more challenging, which is another reason why, despite the fact that you're seeing a slowdown in economic growth from last year's 2.8% growth in the United States, and this year you might only grow at 1.3%, we have not seen the unemployment rate go up very much. So very, very little slack in the unemployment rate. So there's a limited ability to bring production back into the United States and find workers to satisfy or facilitate that production.
Liang, the U.S. tariffs that have been imposed on Asian countries, they range from 10% to 50%. I mean, is this already having an impact on how these Asian nations will approach their export strategies in the future and perhaps develop alternate markets for their goods?
Right. Well, I think that's pretty much, I would say many of the countries are really have this wake-up call and understand that the United States is not a reliable trading partner. As you mentioned, I think in ASEAN countries, many Asian economies, they really wanted to develop new alternative markets. And I think Europeans as well. You just heard, the Chancellor of Germany that talked about need to cultivate new trading partners and relationships. I think pretty much, this will entail some supply chain shifts, and there will be different strategies for different countries depending on, their tariffs and also their market exposure to the United States. And you're right, many of these ASEAN countries are facing 19% of tariff rates, except from, Laos and Myanmar, there are 40%, South Korea, Japan, 15%, and now China, 30% with 90 days truce. So I think it will entail some changes in these different trading relationships. But clearly, I think the United States is shutting itself out of this global trading system. I think when you look at the first, 7 months of the year, the U.S. imports pretty much fell. June it was about 4%. April was a large drop of 16%. And it's forecasted this year's the U.S.'s imports are going to fall by 5%. So in a way, I think the U.S. is really shutting itself out of the global trading system. So I think countries would have to preemptively or after exposed, they have to look for new partners. And I wanted to just echo what Anthony was saying. Tariff is a protective policy, and it could work if it's very well calibrated, not the way that Trump wrote it out in a very unpredictable way. Not to mention, I think other policies are simply not in place to support the so-called reindustrialization. You look at the immigration policy, 1.2 million, less foreign-born workforce so far from January to now, and H-1B visa, which basically helped introduce these skilled workers, that has gone down by 12%. Energy policy is also a misstep. So I think many of these will hinder the U.S.'s manufacturing, sector, despite its protectionist policies.
Anthony Chen, just one other point. I mean, both you and Liang have been talking about immigration as well as labor policy when it comes to bringing industries back to the United States. Reshoring will also mean very large investments in infrastructure in the United States, wouldn't it?
No, there's no question that it's going to lead to more infrastructure spending. But the question is, Is it an efficient use of resources? Is that infrastructure building and spending going to be efficient? Would you not get more output if that same amount of investment took place in another country where labor costs were lower, or in fact, the supply chains were more conducive? So again, forcing the issue arbitrarily this way, it's not clear to me that it's going to be a big positive from an efficiency standpoint.
Bruna, let's get back to Brazil. President Lula is promising to protect Brazilian exporters. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
I want to tell you that the Brazilian government will ensure that our exporters do not suffer losses in the country. They won't.
So if Brazil is to endure 50% tariffs, I mean, how much would that hurt the Brazilian economy?
It hurts, but not as much as it would 20 years ago, I have to say. So Brazil has diversified markets significantly. I think some sectors may find other buyers for certain products like coffee, meat, beef, orange juice, but other more high value-added industrial equipments, motor sector type of equipments, I think they will struggle a little more. So there's only so much you can redirect to other markets, and obviously it takes time. The word now in Brasilia is obviously diversification. Everyone wants to diversify markets. Lula is being pushed to close the Mercosur-EU deal later this year. They are opening markets in Japan for meat, trying to open markets in Australia for Brazil's beef. China, at the same time, is authorizing coffee exporters from Brazil to enter the Chinese market. So I think in certain sectors, the impact will be lower than others. But obviously, in the short term, you have small and mid producers being impacted. And on the other side of this coin, in the US, you also have the consumers here being impacted. 30% of the US consumption of coffee comes from Brazil. And the coffee that's produced in the US goes largely to a more gourmet market, not necessarily the largest chains. So you have the impact in the consumers here in the short and mid-term, and also in the US businesses. So I think it's a lose-lose situation right now. I think there are certain measures that obviously Brazil can take, but the broader picture is not positive for both countries, I have to say that.
Right, and those measures that you talk about, countermeasures, I should say, that Brazil could take, what would they be?
Would they be like loans, low-interest loans to exporters, helping them to redirect that production, alleviating the impacts in their production and exports? But again, there's only so much that can be done in a situation, a fiscal situation that's already not positive in Brazil.
Sourabh, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he is also promising to protect his exporters. He's talking particularly here of India's farmers and the agricultural sector. Let's listen to what he had to say.
For us, our farmers' welfare is supreme. India will never compromise on the well-being of its farmers, dairy workers, and fishermen. And I know personally I will have to pay a heavy price for it, but I'm ready.
Now, the agricultural sector in India is also a powerful political lobby. So what are the political implications for Modi?
Oh, I think there are enormous political implications. You know, in the second term, he's in his third term right now, in the second term, when he was riding high with those huge majorities, he was humbled by a farmers' strike. That was more in North India. The farmers are a very strong political constituency, and there's only so much he can give in the agricultural area. I would say also Trump has kind of given away his game a little bit out here because, you know, set aside that 25% on Russian oil. So India is now facing 25% regular reciprocal tariffs. But the Indians know that, you know, the ASEAN countries are getting 20%, 19%. So even if India is a high tariff country, if it goes a greater distance and goes down to zero, it will get its tariffs reduced from 25 to 20%. And then the equation is, do you want to reduce it by 5%, and let tens of thousands of smallholders lose their livelihoods. And I think that's not a good equation, not a good bargain. So I think he is going to play hard and tough on the farmers' issue.
Anthony, I've got a few minutes left. I want to talk about the European Union. That's another major bloc impacted by Trump tariffs. The deal is 15%. I mean, that was seen as a win for Trump. But US consumers could also end up paying more for European imports, including cars. I mean, how much could that end up costing the US consumer?
Well, there's no question that the consumer is going to be hurt. In fact, when you look at the numbers of products that are imported from all over the world, including Europe, into the United States, those prices are rising in many instances, anywhere from 4 to 7 times faster than the overall components in the consumer price index. So when you hear in the United States that somehow tariffs are having no impact on the consumer prices, it's simply because there are other components that are offsetting. Energy prices, which you talked about earlier in the show, they're going down quite a bit. The housing market is struggling. So when you look at housing components out there like hotels, or you're looking at moving, storage, those things are going down, and many others, and they're offsetting a lot of these tariff goods. And then let's not lose sight of the fact of all the front running that took place with the tariffs. So as the year progresses and these products start to get tariffed, and those prices will be passed on to the consumer. Walmart, for example, telling us that they have a net profit margin of about 4%. And when you have a net profit margin of 4%, you cannot absorb a 15% tariff. You cannot absorb a 30% tariff from other countries like China. So again, most of that is going to be passed on eventually to the consumer. So a good point you made.
Yeah, Liang, very quickly, I've only got 30 seconds. Are we going to see a much bigger focus now by China on its manufacturing model and on domestic consumption, as well as perhaps tweaking its export strategy?
Well, I think all the above. I think China is crafting the new 5-year plan, and it's clear that they will double down on advancing technologies, manufacturing, at the same time with a close eye on boosting domestic demand. And trade is another, I think, a focal point. So far, I think China has been weathering through very well. Trade actually has contributed 30% of its growth in the first half of this year. So I think despite all these headwinds, I think China's economy has been resilient, and that just shows the model has been working.
Okay, and we have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.